The day my mother-in-law called me the help in front of 20 people at Christmas dinner, I just smiled and excused myself to refill the bread basket because I owned the building we were sitting in, not the restaurant, the entire building. 4 floors, 12 commercial units purchased under my holding company in 2019 for just under $3 million. dollars. I had signed the paperwork on a Tuesday afternoon, changed into jeans, and met Carter for tacos that same evening without saying a single word about it. That was the kind of woman I had trained myself to be. Quiet about the big things, careful about what I let people see. Sure. Have you ever had to shrink yourself down just to fit into a room that was never built for you? Have you ever walked into a space knowing you were the most powerful person there and still felt like the walls were closing in? If you have, then you already know my story before I even tell it. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I want to know who's out here with me tonight. And if this is your first time finding this channel, welcome. Hit subscribe. This is going to be a long one. My name is Maya Reeves, and I grew up poor. Not television poor, where the apartment is small but somehow still charming, and the mom always has lipstick on. I mean, genuinely, achingly, embarrassingly poor. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on the south side of Atlanta, my mother and I, in a building where the heat stopped working every January and the landlord stopped answering every February. My mother worked doubles at a hospital laundry facility 6 days a week. She smelled like bleach and exhaustion when she came home, and she never once complained about it in front of me, which is maybe the bravest thing I've ever seen a person do. I started working at 14, bussing tables at a soul food restaurant 2 blocks from our apartment, stuffing every tip into an envelope I kept taped behind my dresser. Not for clothes, not for anything fun. For a real estate licensing prep book I had seen in the window of a bookstore on Peachtree Street. $32. It took me 6 weeks to save enough. I don't tell you this for sympathy. I tell you this because I need you to understand who I was before everything else happened. I need you to know that everything I built from the ground with my own 2 hands. There was no inheritance, no family safety net, no boyfriend who helped me get my first deal. It was just me, that prep book, and an absolute refusal to accept that my zip code was my destiny. By the time I was 23, I had my license, my first rental property, a beat-up duplex in Decatur I flipped and rented out while working a full-time job during the day, and a business plan written in a spiral notebook I still have in my desk drawer. By 26, Reeves Property Group had assets just under $8 million. dollars. I had 11 employees. I had a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Atlanta skyline. And sometimes I would stand at that window in the early morning before anyone else arrived and just breathe, because I couldn't quite believe the view was mine. I was 27 when I met Carter Whitfield. It was a Saturday in October, the kind of Atlanta fall day that makes you forget the summer ever happened. Cool air, gold light, the smell of leaves starting to turn. I was at a small coffee shop in Midtown that I went to specifically because no one there knew me. No one asked about deals or cap rates or quarterly projections. I could just sit with my oat milk latte and read and be a regular person for an hour. He was at the table next to mine, and he knocked over his coffee, reaching for his phone. It went straight into my bag. He was mortified, genuinely, completely mortified. Face red, stumbling over apologies, offering to buy me a new bag, a new coffee, a new everything. And I laughed. I actually laughed, which surprised me because I hadn't been laughing much that year. Work had been consuming everything. I couldn't remember the last time I'd gone on a date, the last time I'd let myself just sit with another human being and not think about business. Carter Whitfield was tall, sandy-haired, with the kind of easy smile that makes you feel like you're the most interesting person in the room. He was charming in a way that felt effortless rather than performed. He asked if he could buy me another coffee to apologize, and I said yes, and we talked for 3 hours. He told me he worked in marketing, freelance, mostly, some contract work for a few firms in Buckhead. He seemed comfortable but not wealthy. Nice watch, nothing flashy, drove a sensible car. He asked what I did, and I told him I worked in real estate, which was true. I just didn't specify in what capacity. He didn't push. I like that. What I didn't tell Carter, what I didn't tell anyone I dated, not since the one man who had asked me out 6 months after I closed my first major deal, and then immediately started referring to my business as our business in conversations with his friends, was anything about Reeves Property Group, anything about the assets, the employees, the building I had just purchased in Buckhead. I was tired of not knowing if someone was interested in me or in what I had. And I was afraid of the answer, if I'm being honest. It was easier to just be Maya, just a girl in a coffee shop with an oat milk latte and a ruined tote bag. So that's who I was with Carter. For months, that's who I was. We dated for 8 months before he proposed. They were, genuinely, 8 of the best months I had experienced in years. He brought me coffee on Sunday mornings. He remembered small things, that I hated cilantro, that I always got cold in movie theaters, that my mother's birthday was in March and I always got quiet around that time because grief does that. It turns anniversaries into something heavy. He showed up, he was present. He made me feel like I was enough just as I was, without the buildings, without the company, without any of it. I convinced myself that was real. I wanted it to be real so badly. He proposed on a Sunday evening in Piedmont Park, just the two of us, no audience, no performance. Just him on one knee in a simple solitaire ring and his voice shaking a little when he asked. I said yes before he finished the sentence. Tony, my best friend since college, the only person in my life who knew everything, sat across from me at dinner the following week and looked at me for a long moment before she spoke. Does he know? She asked. Not yet, I said. She nodded slowly. Maya, I know, I said. I'll tell him after the wedding. I just, I need to know this is real first. She didn't argue. She's known me long enough to know when I've already decided something. She just reached across the table and squeezed my hand and said, okay, but you tell me everything. Always, I said. The first time I met Diane Whitfield, Carter and I had been together for 4 months. He drove us up to their home in Brookhaven on a Sunday, a large, immaculate colonial with white columns and a lawn that looked like someone measured every blade of grass. I wore a simple blue dress. I had my hair out, natural, big, and full the way I like it. Carter had his hand on mine the whole drive up, telling me his mother was just a little old fashioned and that she came around once she got to know people. I should have asked more questions about that phrase. Came around. Came around from what exactly? Diane Whitfield opened the front door before we even reached the porch. She was a tall woman, lean in the way that suggested discipline rather than luck, with silver blonde hair cut short and precise. She had the kind of posture that made you want to straighten your own spine just standing near her. She kissed Carter on the cheek, then turned to me. She looked at me the way someone looks at a piece of furniture they're not sure will fit the room. See, she said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. You're Maya. I am, I said and smiled and extended my hand. She shook it briefly. Carter's told us so little about you. She said it like it was a light observation, like it wasn't a small blade slid between my ribs. Gerald Whitfield was easier. A quiet, pleasant man who asked me about Atlanta and seemed genuinely interested in the answer. Savannah, Carter's younger sister, was at the house too, home from her second year of grad school, and she was warm in that energetic, slightly overwhelming way of people who are trying very hard to make a good impression. I liked her immediately, or thought I did. Dinner was pot roast and polite conversation. Diane asked me what I did. I told her I worked in real estate, freelance mostly. She nodded with that same expression she'd worn at the door, the one that says she was cataloging information and had not yet decided what to do with it. Real estate can be so unstable, she said pleasantly. Carter, You remember the Hendersons? Dreadful situation. Carter laughed and changed the subject. He didn't look at me. That was the first time I noticed it. That small, subtle failure to hold ground. It passed quickly. He reached over and refilled my water glass without being asked, and I told myself it meant nothing. Couples navigate difficult families all the time. It wasn't a warning sign, it was just dinner. I told myself that. We got married 7 months later in a small ceremony in Savannah. The city, not the sister. 40 people. My mother's garden roses in the centerpieces because she had loved them and I wanted her there somehow, even though she'd been gone for 3 years by then. Tony stood beside me. Carter cried a little when I walked toward him, and I thought, um, this is real. This is real. This is real. The plan had been to get our own place. We looked at apartments, talked about neighborhoods, had a whole spreadsheet of options. Then, 2 weeks before the wedding, Carter sat me down and explained gently that his mother had asked if we would consider living with them temporarily, just for a year, maybe two, because his father's health had been declining and she needed support. Carter's marketing contracts had dried up recently, and he felt it was the right thing to do for the family. I felt something shift in my chest when he said it. Not quite alarm. More like that feeling of putting your foot down on a step in the dark and finding the drop longer than you expected. But he looked at me with those eyes that had said, "You are enough on a Sunday in Piedmont Park." And I said yes. We moved into the Whitfield house on a Saturday in June. Carter carried the boxes. Diane stood in the foyer and watched. That first evening, after Carter had gone to help his father with his evening medication and Savannah had disappeared upstairs, Diane found me in the kitchen making tea. She set a folded piece of paper on the counter beside me without a word. I picked it up. It was a handwritten list. Weekly grocery runs, organized by store and day, specific cleaning tasks for specific rooms on specific days, laundry schedule, meal planning expectations for the week. I read it twice. Then Diane said from the doorway, "I hope you're not one of those girls who expects to be waited on." She said it pleasantly, the way someone comments on the weather. I folded the paper in half. I looked at her. I smiled. The same smile I had used for years in boardrooms when men twice my age tried to talk over me. The smile that said, "I see exactly what you're doing, and I am not afraid of you." "Of course not," I said. She nodded once, satisfied, and left the room. I stood alone in that kitchen for a long moment, the paper in my hand, the tea cooling on the counter, the sound of the house settling around me. Through the window, I could see the perfectly maintained backyard, the rose bushes that someone, probably a landscaper Diane didn't pay nearly enough, kept in perfect order. I thought about my mother, about all the hours she had spent in service of other people's comfort and never once been thanked properly for it. I thought about the girl I had been at 14, saving $32 6 weeks to buy a book. I thought about my office, empty right now on a Saturday evening, the city lights starting to come on outside those floor to ceiling windows. And I thought, she has absolutely no idea who she is talking to. I set the list down on the counter and finished making my tea. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. It lives somewhere behind your eyes. It settles into your shoulders around 7 in the morning and doesn't leave until well past midnight. It's the exhaustion of performing, of being exactly what a room needs you to be while swallowing everything you actually are. I had known versions of that feeling before, in boardrooms, in negotiations where I was the only Black woman at the table and had to be twice as precise and half as emotional just to be taken seriously. But nothing I had experienced before the Whitfield house compared to what the next 2 years of my life would cost me. The list Diane left me that first evening turned out to be just the beginning. By the second week, I understood the unspoken architecture of that household. There were rules that were never stated directly. Diane was too refined for that, but communicated through silence, through a slightly tilted head, through the way she would run one finger along a surface I had just cleaned and say nothing, which somehow communicated more than any criticism could. The kitchen was to be spotless by 8 in the morning. Groceries were to be purchased from specific stores in a specific order. And if I brought home the wrong brand of something, the wrong pasta, the wrong olive oil, a slightly different cut of meat than what she preferred, she would set it on the counter with the receipt beside it and wait. Carter thought I was adjusting beautifully. That was the word he used, adjusting. Like I was a thermostat. Like the process of dismantling my entire identity to fit inside his mother's house was just a matter of finding the right setting. I kept my mouth shut. I smiled. I learned the olive oil brand. Savannah was around on weekends, and in those early months, she was genuinely pleasant to me, curious about my life, funny in an offbeat way, occasionally pulling me aside to roll her eyes at something her mother had said, making me feel like I had an unlikely ally. I trusted that feeling more than I should have. Gerald, Carter's father, was the one I genuinely felt for. He had congestive heart failure and moved carefully through the house, like a man who was always aware of the distance to the nearest chair. He was kind to me in quiet ways, thanking me for meals, asking about my day, and actually listening to the answer. Once telling me with complete sincerity that I had a good head on my shoulders after I fixed a billing error in one of his medical statements that nobody else had noticed. I didn't tell him that catching billing discrepancies was something I did in my sleep. I just said thank you. I had set up a small home office in the room they had given us, officially the guest room, until Carter and I were occupying it, at which point Diane began referring to it as Carter's old room, always Carter's, never ours. And every morning before the house woke up, I was at my laptop from 5 to 7, running my company, conference calls on mute with headphones in, emails fired off in the dark, decisions that involved hundreds of thousands of dollars made quietly while coffee brewed 2 floors below me. Derek knew to route everything through a second email address. My team had been briefed. If anyone asked, their boss was traveling extensively and preferred digital communication. I had built a firewall around my entire life, and I maintained it daily. Carter never asked why I was always up so early. He assumed I was a morning person. That assumption told me everything about how carefully he had never actually looked at me. The changes in him came gradually, and I want to be precise about this because I've spent a long time trying to understand how I missed what was in front of me. The truth is, I didn't miss it. I saw it and chose explanations that let me stay. The first thing was the phone. Carter had always been easy with his phone around me, leaving it on the table, face up, not performing the particular kind of casualness that people perform when they're hiding something. Around month 3 in the house, the phone started going face down, started going into his pocket when he left rooms, started being dead at specific times of day with suspicious regularity. I filed it. I didn't act on it. I told myself stress. His freelance work had nearly dried up completely, and he was quietly, visibly humiliated by it in ways he would never have admitted out loud. His father was sick. His mother's expectations were a pressure system that affected everyone in that house, including him. I gave him room I shouldn't have given him. The second thing was the questions. Specifically, questions about money. Mine. They started casually. How does the commission structure work in real estate? Then, do freelancers in your field usually put anything away, like investments? Then, one evening while I was making dinner, I was just thinking, if anything ever happened to either of us, would we have enough? Like, do you have savings? A plan? I kept my voice level. I said I had some savings, that I was careful with money, that we'd be okay. He nodded like that was a satisfying answer. It wasn't curiosity. I know now it wasn't curiosity, but I wasn't ready to know that yet. The third thing, the thing that cracked something open in me, was Tony. Carter had met Tony twice. Both times he'd been perfectly pleasant with her, laughed at her jokes, engaged her comfortably. Then one Sunday, I mentioned that Tony was coming over to drop something off, and something moved across his face, fast, almost imperceptible, before he smoothed it back into neutral. Does she have to come inside? He said. My mother's got a headache. I turned from the counter slowly. She's dropping off a book. It'll take 5 minutes. I just, she's a lot, Maya. She's loud. Tony is many things. She is warm. She is sharp. She is one of the most loyal human beings alive. She is not loud. She is a black woman who takes up space without apologizing for it. And I understood exactly what Carter was reacting to, even if he would never have said it that plainly. I told Tony to meet me down the street instead. I told her I'd explain later. She looked at me over her coffee cup with an expression that I recognized. She'd been collecting evidence longer than I had. You need to tell me everything, she said. Not yet, I said. I'm still figuring out what everything is. I found out I was pregnant in April, 7 months into living in that house. I sat on the bathroom floor for a long time after seeing the test, knees pulled to my chest, back against the cold tile of the tub. I wasn't devastated. I wasn't overjoyed in the uncomplicated way I might have been in a different life. I felt something more complicated than either of those things. A fierce animal protectiveness that arrived so quickly it almost knocked the breath out of me, mixed with a fear I couldn't quite name yet. I told Carter that evening. He hugged me, said the right things, called his mother downstairs. Diane's first response, after a pause that lasted exactly 1 beat too long, was, "Well, let's hope it's a boy." She said it with a little laugh, like it was a harmless wish, like I hadn't just heard her assign a condition to her own future grandchild's worth before the child had even taken a breath. Carter said nothing. I said, "We'll love whoever it is," and looked at my husband when I said it, and he looked at the floor. Lily came in December, 3 weeks before Christmas, on a gray Tuesday morning that smelled like rain. She was 7 pounds, 4 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and a cry that was so immediate and outraged that the nurse laughed and said, "She's got opinions." I held her against my chest in the delivery room and felt something rearrange itself permanently inside me. There are moments in your life that work like a hinge. Everything after them swings differently than everything before. Lily was mine. Diane arrived at the hospital 3 hours after the birth with a flower arrangement and a remark about how she'd been hoping for a spring baby, better for parties. She stood at the edge of the room and looked at Lily in Carter's arms with an expression I can only describe as assessment, like she was deciding something. Then she said she needed coffee and left the room and did not hold her granddaughter that day, not once. Carter held Lily longer, and he was gentler with her than I expected him to be, and I let that be enough for a while. I let it be evidence of something good in him that outweighed the other things. That is the particular foolishness of loving someone you're already starting to not trust. You collect their good moments like currency and spend them against the damage. The early weeks home were brutal in the way that early weeks with a newborn always are, multiplied by the specific misery of recovering in someone else's house with someone else's rules. Diane restructured the household expectations without discussion. There were now baby things that needed to stay out of the common areas, which meant Lily's bouncer, her swing, her tummy time mat, all needed to be confined to our room. The room that was still, in Diane's language, Carter's room. I was nursing around the clock, running my company on a phone balanced on a burp cloth, and maintaining the cleaning schedule because nobody else was going to do it. Carter had picked up a small contract and was working from a shared office space 3 days a week, which I later understood was not a shared office space. One afternoon, when Lily was 6 weeks old, I needed to run to the pharmacy. A 20-minute round trip, nothing more. Diane said she would watch the baby. I kissed Lily's forehead, I strapped on my shoes, and I left. I was gone 18 minutes. When I came back, I heard Lily before I saw her. A high, sharp cry. The kind that is different from hunger or discomfort. The kind that hits a mother somewhere below rational thought. I went through the kitchen and found Lily on the floor beside the high chair. The high chair Diane had insisted on setting up, even though Lily was nowhere near old enough for it, had insisted on buckling her into for practice. The buckle had failed, or hadn't been done correctly, or something had shifted, and Lily had fallen. She was on the padded kitchen rug, not the hardwood, and she was crying but breathing. And when I picked her up and ran my hands over her, she was whole. She was okay. The pediatrician later confirmed she was fine. But her left arm was bruised from where she'd hit the chair's tray on the way down. Diane was at the kitchen table. She had a cup of tea and a magazine open in front of her. She looked up when I came in and said, "She fussed a bit. She'll be all right." I stood there holding my daughter, who was 6 weeks old and already bruised inside the walls of this house. And I looked at this woman who had looked at my child the way you look at furniture and left the hospital without holding her. And I felt something inside me go absolutely, completely, and permanently quiet. Not the quiet of defeat, something colder than that, something that knew exactly what it was doing. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't say a word to Diane. I walked out of the kitchen, went upstairs, closed the door, sat on the edge of the bed with Lily pressed against my chest, and I called Tony. She answered on the first ring. "I need to tell you something," I said. "Okay," she said. "Carter's been lying to me. His mother just let Lily get hurt and acted like it was nothing. And I think," my voice caught just once. I pressed my lips together and waited until it passed. "I think I've been waiting for something to get bad enough that I'd have permission to act. And I think that just happened." Tony was quiet for a moment. Then, "Maya, you have always had permission. You're the one who built the door. You just kept choosing not to open it." I looked down at Lily. She had stopped crying. She was looking up at me with those dark, steady eyes that somehow already looked like she was working something out. "I know," I said quietly. "I'm opening it now." What I didn't say to Tony, what I was already turning over in my mind as I sat there in that room that had never really been mine, was that opening a door was one thing. What you put on the other side of it was something else entirely. And I had resources Diane Whitfield had never imagined. I had connections. I had patience that had been sharpened over years of working in rooms where people underestimated me. And I had the kind of quiet anger that doesn't scream, that plans. I held my daughter a little tighter, listened to the sound of the house below me, Diane's heels on the hardwood, the television Gerald kept on low in the study, the particular silence where Carter should have been and wasn't. And I began, for the first time, to think about what it would look like when this was over. Not if, when. Planning is a specific kind of prayer. You don't bow your head. You don't close your eyes. You sit very still in the middle of whatever chaos surrounds you, and you think 3 moves ahead, and you trust the work. I had been praying for 6 weeks by the time Carter came home with flowers. Not grocery store flowers, actual arrangement flowers. The kind from the florist on Peachtree that came wrapped in brown paper and cost more than our weekly groceries. He set them on the kitchen counter while I was feeding Lily her evening bottle, and he leaned against the door frame with his hands in his pockets and that smile. The original one, the coffee shop one, the one I had once thought was just for me, and said he'd been thinking about us, about how hard things had been, about how he wanted to do better. I looked at the flowers. I looked at him. I said, "They're beautiful, Carter. Thank you." I had already spoken to Derek twice that week. Here is something they don't tell you about being a woman who plans. People confuse your stillness for surrender. Carter looked at me accepting those flowers and heard what he needed to hear. That I was settling back in, that the distance he'd felt from me was closing, that things were returning to whatever version of normal he preferred. Diane noticed me becoming quieter and interpreted it as the household finally working as intended. Even Savannah, who had started dropping by more frequently with an edge of nervous energy I was only beginning to understand, seemed to relax. None of them considered that quiet women are sometimes the most dangerous ones in the room. Derek Moss had been my attorney since my third property acquisition. He was meticulous, discreet, and constitutionally incapable of panic. Qualities I had valued professionally and now valued in ways I couldn't have anticipated when I first hired him. I called him from my parked car 2 blocks from the house, Lily asleep in her car seat in the back, the engine running for warmth against a cold January afternoon. I need 2 things, I told him. I need a family law referral, someone who handles high asset divorce cases and doesn't leak. And I need to know the legal standing of a spouse who has been kept financially uninformed during a marriage. Derek was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. How uninformed are we talking? He thinks I do freelance real estate work, I said. He has never seen a tax return. He does not know the name of my company. Another pause. Maya, I know. That's going to be a complicated untangle. I know that too, I said. That's why I'm calling you now instead of later. What followed over the next several weeks was a process that required a level of compartmentalization I hadn't known I was capable of. During the day, I was Carter's wife, Diane's daughter in law, Lily's mother. Present, functional, unremarkable. Before sunrise and after Lily's last feeding, I was something else entirely. Reviewing documents Derek sent through the secure portal, corresponding with the family law attorney he connected me with, a woman named Patricia Cole, who had the energy of someone who had seen every variation of human betrayal and was bored by none of it. Patricia asked me in our first call what outcome I was seeking. I told her full custody of Lily, clean financial separation, and whatever the law would allow me in terms of accountability for a spouse who had demonstrably deceived me about his fidelity and his intentions. She said, let's talk about what we can document. So we talked about documentation. The private investigator's name was Marcus Webb. Tony had found him through a contact she refused to identify, which told me the contact was either in law enforcement or adjacent to it, and that Tony had spent her own time building this resource for me without being asked, which was the most Tony thing imaginable. Marcus was a quiet man who communicated primarily through a secure app and delivered files with the efficiency of someone who understood that his clients were already hurting and didn't need information drawn out. The first file arrived on a Wednesday morning. I opened it in my car, parked in the lot of a grocery store 2 miles from the house. Lily in the back again. Lily was my cover story for most of my necessary privacy during this period. Taking the baby for a drive, she sleeps better in the car. Nobody questioned it. The file contained photographs and corresponding location data spanning 11 days. Carter's shared office space was confirmed to be a short-term rental apartment in Buckhead that was leased under a name I didn't recognize. A shell, Marcus noted in his attached summary, likely arranged through a mutual contact. The photographs showed Carter entering and leaving the building at times that corresponded with gaps in his stated schedule. They showed him not alone. The first woman was young, mid-20s, professional looking, the kind of pretty that is also somehow generic. They had apparently been meeting for several months. The second woman surprised me more. She was someone Carter had introduced me to at a dinner party 8 months earlier as a former colleague. She had shaken my hand and said my name back to me with a smile that I had read as warmth. I understood now it was something else. The particular tension of someone maintaining 2 faces in the same room. I sat in that parking lot for a long time. I want to be honest with you about what I felt, because I think there's a version of this story where I tell you I felt nothing, that I had already detached, that my planning had made me invulnerable to the actual human pain of it. That would be a cleaner story. It wouldn't be true. What I felt was grief, specific and sharp, for the man I had believed Carter was in a coffee shop on a Saturday in October. That man, the one who remembered I hated cilantro, the one whose voice shook when he proposed. I mourned him genuinely, sitting in that parking lot with his betrayal documented in a folder on my phone. Because the worst thing about being deceived by someone you loved is that the love doesn't instantly convert into something easier to carry. It just sits there alongside the evidence. Both things, real at the same time. I gave myself 20 minutes. I cried quietly, watching the grocery store entrance like it was something I needed to monitor. Then Lily made a small sound in her sleep. Not a cry, just a murmur. one of those sounds that means she's dreaming something gentle, and I wiped my face, closed the folder, and drove home. I was done grieving Carter Whitfield in private. The idea for the property came from Diane, which is maybe the most poetic thing I can tell you about how this whole situation resolved itself. It was a Sunday in February. Gerald was having a better day and had come downstairs for breakfast, which didn't happen often anymore, and the whole family was gathered at the table. Carter, Diane, Savannah, Gerald, Lily, and her bouncer on the floor beside me. And Diane was talking about a property she'd read about in a neighborhood newsletter. A large home in a gated community north of the city, recently listed. Apparently, the previous owners had relocated abroad suddenly and priced it to sell quickly. Diane said the price was remarkable, said it was exactly the kind of investment a family should make, said it was a shame they didn't have the liquidity for it right now. Carter said, "What kind of price are we talking?" Diane said, 2.3. Carter whistled low. For that neighborhood, that's almost nothing. Which is why, Diane said, with the particular emphasis she used when she was saying the real thing after the pretend thing, it won't be on the market long. I cut Lily's banana into smaller pieces and did not look up from the table, but I was already thinking. The property at 4814 Harlan Gate Drive had a complicated history that required 3 phone calls and access to 2 county databases to fully understand. I understood it by Tuesday. The home had been built in 2018 on a parcel of land that sat at the intersection of 2 contested easements, a dispute between the original developer and the county that had been unresolved since 2019 and was currently the subject of ongoing litigation. The title was technically transferable, but any transfer triggered a mandatory legal review that had, in 3 previous attempted sales, stalled and eventually collapsed the transactions. The listing agent, a man I did not know personally, but whose license I pulled and reviewed, had disclosed the easement situation in a supplemental document attached to the listing. Disclosed it, technically, but buried it in the kind of language that required someone with specific real estate legal knowledge to interpret. Carter and Diane did not have that knowledge. They also, as I knew, did not have the habit of reading supplemental documents. Additionally, the contractor who had built the home had filed a mechanics lien against the property in 2021 for $800,000 in unpaid construction costs. That lien had been purchased, bought from the original contractor as part of a portfolio of distressed construction debt by a small investment firm called Meridian Asset Holdings. I had created Meridian Asset Holdings in 2020. I want to pause here because I know how this sounds, and I need you to understand something. I did not manufacture this situation. I did not create the easement dispute. I did not create the unpaid debt. I did not design the legal complexity of this property. All of that existed before I ever heard the address. What I did was recognize it. Recognize it the way you recognize the shape of something you've been waiting for, and position myself accordingly. There is a difference between building a trap and simply understanding that one already exists. I called Derek on Tuesday evening. I explained what I had in mind. He was quiet for longer than usual. "This is legal," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "Every element of it, I said. "Complicated," he said. "Deliberately," I said. "Maya." A pause. "How long have you been sitting on that lien?" "About 2 years." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "All right," he said. "Tell me the rest." The setup required patience, which I had, and a single point of contact I could trust to introduce the property to Carter without it appearing to come from me. Tony, through her own professional network, knew a woman named Renee who worked in property management and moved casually in the same social circles as Savannah. Renee was not told the full picture. She was simply asked to mention the Harlan Gate property to Savannah at a social event as a remarkable deal she'd heard about through a colleague. Savannah, as I had accurately predicted, brought it to Diane before the week was out. Diane brought it to Carter. Carter came to me. He was warm about it, warmer than he'd been in months, which told me everything about what he was actually after. He sat across from me at the kitchen table one evening while Lily slept, and he talked about the property with a kind of lit up energy I recognized from our early months together. He talked about investment potential, about building something for Lily's future, about how this could be a real turning point for the family. Then, carefully, so carefully, he said he'd been thinking that maybe I had some savings we could put toward a down payment, that maybe it was time we thought about combining resources properly. I let him talk. I asked a few questions. I said I'd think about it. Then I said, in the most offhand tone I could manage, I heard about that property too, actually, through work. I think it's a legitimate opportunity. But Carter, if you're serious, you should move fast. That price won't hold. He looked at me like I had handed him something. 3 days later, he told me he was looking into financing options. A week after that, he told me he'd spoken with a lender. He had used the house, the Whitfield family home, Gerald's house, as collateral, along with a business loan in his own name. The total financing package came to just over $2 million. I did not talk him into this. I want to be clear about that. I mentioned the property once in passing and let him run, because that's what Carter did. He ran toward things that looked like shortcuts. He always had. I had just never understood what that meant for me until I was already inside it. He signed the purchase agreement on a Thursday morning. I know the exact time because Derek texted me when the transaction hit the county record system. I was at the park with Lily. She was trying, with enormous seriousness, to eat a piece of wood chip she'd found near the bench. I removed the wood chip. I read Derek's text. I looked at my daughter's face, round and determined and absolutely certain about what she wanted. And I felt something release in my chest that had been clenched for so long, I had forgotten it wasn't supposed to feel that way. 1 week later, I filed for divorce. Carter's attorney called Derek the morning after service was delivered. I was not on that call, but Derek related to me in precise detail that evening, which I will relay to you now in less precise detail because some of it is still in legal process, and some of it I simply don't have the words for yet. Carter had discovered, upon attempting to begin the title transfer for 4814 Harlan Gate Drive, that the easement dispute made the transfer legally frozen pending resolution of the county litigation. Resolution that Patricia Cole's research suggested was at minimum 18 months away. He had also discovered the mechanic's lien, and in attempting to identify the holding company behind the lien, Meridian Asset Holdings, in order to negotiate a payoff, he had discovered something that I imagine felt, in that moment, like the floor dropping out from under him. Meridian Asset Holdings was registered to a parent company. That parent company was Reeves Property Group. His attorney, relaying this through Derek, asked whether there had been some kind of mistake. Derek said there had not been a mistake. There was a long silence on the call, Derek told me, before Carter's attorney spoke again. When he did, Derek said, his voice had changed. Not angry, just recalibrated, like someone who had just understood the actual shape of the chessboard. Carter's attorney asked, "Who exactly is Maya Reeves?" Derek said pleasantly that he would be happy to provide the full corporate documentation if counsel would like to review it. I was sitting on the floor of our room, Carter's room, the room that had never been mine, with Lily in my lap and her board book open between us when Derek called to tell me how it had gone. Lily was pointing at the pictures with one finger, narrating in her own private language. The house was quiet below us. Carter was somewhere I didn't know, learning something I had known was coming for months. I read Lily the page she was pointing at. Something about a duck and a pond and the color yellow. She slapped the page with her whole palm, delighted. Outside, the winter light was going fast, the way it does in February. There and then, suddenly not there. The sky shifting from pale blue to something darker in the space of minutes. I watched it through the window. I thought about a 2-bedroom apartment in Atlanta where the heat stopped working every January. I thought about $32 in 6 weeks and a book in a window. I thought, I built every single piece of this, and not one of them ever asked how. Lily turned the page herself, proud of the mechanism of it, and looked up at me to see if I had noticed. I saw, I told her. Good job, baby. She grinned, beside and unguarded and completely sure of herself, and turned back to her book. I held her a little closer and let the room get dark around us, and I did not turn on the light. The morning after I let that room go dark, I woke up before Lily and lay still for a few minutes, just listening to her breathe. There is something about the sound of your child sleeping that reorganizes your priorities without asking permission. All the noise, the legal filings, the financial structures, the careful architecture of everything I had built and everything I had dismantled went quiet, and what was left was just that sound. Small lungs, steady rhythm. The particular piece of someone who does not yet know that the world requires defending against. I had spent so long being strategic that I had almost forgotten what it felt like to simply be in a moment without calculating its angle. That morning, in the gray light before the house woke up, I let myself stay in it, just for a little while. Then Lily opened her eyes, looked directly at me, and said, with complete authority, up. So we got up. The divorce proceedings moved faster than Carter's attorney had anticipated, which Patricia Cole told me with the specific satisfaction of someone who had laid groundwork carefully and was now watching it hold. Carter had arrived at the negotiating table in a position that can only be described as catastrophically unprepared. The financing he had taken out against the Whitfield family home, Gerald's home, the colonial in Brookhaven with the measured lawn, was now in default review because the asset it had been used to acquire was legally frozen. The business loan in Carter's name had triggered a covenant clause when the property transfer stalled, making the full balance callable. He was, in the language of finance, significantly underwater, and the water was rising. His attorney was competent. I want to be fair about that. He worked with what he had. What he had was a client who had structured nothing, documented nothing, and whose primary financial strategy had been to marry a woman he believed had modest savings and then position himself to access them through the natural architecture of a shared life. That strategy required me to be who Carter thought I was. I was not who Carter thought I was. Patricia presented the full scope of Reeves Property Group's holdings in the third session. I was told Carter's expression, when the binder was placed in front of him, was one she had seen before. Not anger, not immediately, but a particular blankness that comes from genuine recalibration. Like a map you've been navigating with suddenly revealing itself to be the wrong map entirely. He had known, by that point, about Meridian Asset Holdings. He had known for several weeks that the lien holding his purchase hostage belonged to a company that traced back to me. But knowing one piece of a thing is not the same as seeing the whole of it. The binder Patricia placed in front of him contained 11 years of corporate history, 8 figures in current assets, properties in 4 states, a company that had been running, fully operational, for the entirety of our relationship, through every Sunday coffee, every movie theater where I got cold, every quiet morning he'd assumed I was simply a person who liked rising early. Patricia told me later that he said, very quietly to no one in particular, the whole time. She said she had nodded and moved on to the custody section. I did not attend those sessions in person. Patricia represented me. I was, during the weeks the legal process moved through its stages, focused almost entirely on Lily and on the quieter work of figuring out where we were going to live. Because I had decided, with a clarity that surprised even me, that I did not want to return to any property I currently owned. I wanted to start somewhere new, not because the old places weren't mine, but because I needed a space that Lily and I had chosen together, that had no history attached to it, no layer of someone else's assumptions soaked into the walls. Tony helped me find it. A house in a neighborhood I had always liked but never lived in. Tree-lined streets, a yard with an actual yard, a kitchen with south-facing windows that flooded with light in the mornings. It was modest by the standards of what I could afford, which was intentional. I wanted to come home to something that felt like breathing out. We moved on a Saturday in late March. Tony brought food. Derek brought a plant he had no business purchasing, a large fiddly fig in a terracotta pot that he carried through the front door with the energy of a man who had just done something he was privately very pleased about. Lily, who had recently discovered that she could run, not walk fast, actually run, with the unsteady, ecstatic momentum of someone newly in possession of a superpower, ran from room to room while Tony and I stood in the kitchen and watched and didn't say anything for a while. "You did it," Tony said. "We did it," I said. "You found Marcus, you found Renee. You built the whole thing," she said. "I just handed you a couple of tools." I looked at my daughter running. I thought about the word built and all the things it had meant in my life. The duplex in Decatur, the holding company, the portfolio, the patient, careful construction of a plan inside a house that had tried to reduce me to a cleaning schedule and a list of approved grocery stores. "Yeah," I said, "I did." The court awarded me full custody of Lily. Carter received supervised visitation rights pending a behavioral review. The documentation Marcus had collected, combined with a detailed account of the incident with Lily in the high chair, had been entered into the record. Patricia had presented it without drama, which she said was always more effective than presenting it with drama. The judge had read it in silence and then looked at Carter for a long moment before moving on. Carter did not contest the custody arrangement. I think by that point, he understood the shape of the situation he was in well enough to know which battles he could not win. The financial settlement was straightforward in the way that things are straightforward when one party has everything documented and the other party has very little leverage. Carter retained his personal belongings and a small residual from a savings account that predated our marriage. The debt from the Harlan Gate property, the full outstanding balance owed to Meridian Asset Holdings, was confirmed as his sole liability, structured as a repayment obligation that would follow him for years. He had used the Whitfield family home as collateral for a purchase that could not be completed. The bank moved to collect. The Whitfield family home sold at foreclosure in June. I heard about it from Tony, who heard about it through Savannah. Because yes, Savannah called Tony, apparently believing that Tony might serve as an intermediary, might carry some message back to me, might soften some edge. Tony listened politely and then called me immediately after and told me what she'd heard. Diane and Gerald Whitfield moved into a smaller house in a less prominent neighborhood. Gerald's health continued to decline. I harbor no particular feeling about Gerald. He was a man who had consistently chosen absence over intervention, and that choice had consequences like all choices do. But he had also been genuinely kind to me in small ways that I have not forgotten. I hope his remaining time is peaceful. Diane did not reach out to me directly for several months. When she finally did, it was a letter. Actual paper, handwritten, which I will admit I had not expected. I stood at my kitchen counter on a Tuesday morning with Lily eating cereal at the table behind me and read it twice. It was not an apology exactly. It was the kind of letter a person writes when they need to say something but cannot fully bring themselves to say the actual thing. There was acknowledgement, of a sort, that things had been difficult. There was a mention of Lily, that she hoped Lily was well, that she was her grandmother after all. There was a line near the end that said, "I may not have understood the situation as fully as I believed I did." I read that line a third time. I may not have understood the situation as fully as I believed I did. For a woman who had looked at me on my first evening in her house and handed me a cleaning schedule. For a woman who had said, "Let's hope it's a boy," about my unborn child and left a hospital without holding her granddaughter, and sat at a kitchen table with a magazine while that granddaughter cried on the floor. This was, I suppose, something. Not enough. Not close to enough. But something. I folded the letter. I put it in a drawer. I have not responded to it, and I have not decided yet whether I will. Some things don't require a response. Sometimes the most complete thing you can say is nothing, which says everything. The magazine piece ran in April. A regional business publication, the kind of outlet that covers Atlanta's commercial real estate market with genuine depth, had been requesting an interview with me for nearly a year. I had declined twice. The third time they asked, I said yes. The photographer came to my office on a Wednesday. I wore a blazer I had bought myself when I closed my first seven-figure deal. I'd held on to it, never worn it to anything significant, waiting for a moment that felt right. I held Lily on my hip for one of the shots, which was not planned, but happened when she refused to stay with the editorial assistant and simply walked across the room and lifted her arms at me with the absolute confidence of someone who knows they will be picked up. The piece ran under the headline, "From the Ground Up." I did not write the headline, but I would have. They asked me about the beginning, about Atlanta, about my mother, about the duplex in Decatur, about the $32 book. I told all of it. For the first time in a professional context, I told all of it, without editing, without strategic omission. The journalist, a woman about my age who took notes by hand and looked up frequently, asked at the end whether there was anything I wished I had done differently. I thought about it for a real moment, not the performed pause of someone who has prepared an answer, an actual moment of sitting with the question. I spent a long time, I said finally, making myself invisible so that people would see me more clearly. Like, if I removed everything that made them uncomfortable, they'd finally be able to look at me without the filters. What I learned is that the filters were never mine to manage. People see what they're willing to see. You can't curate your way into someone's respect. You either have it or you don't. And if you don't, the answer isn't to make yourself smaller. It's to build something big enough that the question stops mattering. She wrote that down. She underlined something. She thanked me for my time. The piece ran 12 pages later in the issue with a full-page photograph. Me at my desk, Lily on my hip, the Atlanta skyline visible through the windows behind us, both of us looking directly at the camera with the same expression that I did not plan and cannot fully describe except to say that it looked, according to Tony when she texted me the morning it published. Like, we both already knew something the room didn't. I saved a copy. I will give it to Lily when she's old enough to understand what she's looking at. People ask me sometimes, in comments, in messages, occasionally in person, whether I regret hiding who I was, whether I think the whole thing could have been avoided if I had just been upfront from the beginning. If I had told Carter on that first Saturday in the coffee shop what I actually did, who I actually was. I have thought about this more than I can tell you. Here is what I believe. I don't regret wanting to be loved simply. That desire to be seen without the architecture, without the portfolio, without the number, was real, and it came from a real place, and I will not be embarrassed about it. What I regret is confusing that desire with a strategy. I thought that if I removed the things that complicated me, I would become easier to love. What I actually became was easier to underestimate. Those are not the same thing, and the distance between them cost me 2 years I will not get back. But here's the other thing I believe. Those 2 years made me a mother. They put Lily in the world, and Lily is the most specific and clarifying thing that has ever happened to me. She is the reason I opened the door when I did, and not later. She is the reason the anger I carried stayed cold instead of going hot. Because hot anger makes mistakes, and I could not afford mistakes. She made me precise in a way that nothing else could have. So I carry the regret and the gratitude in the same hand. That's just how it is. Last month, Lily learned to say moon. She's been saying it constantly since, pointing at the ceiling light, at a white balloon at a grocery store, at my earring, all of it. Moon, moon, moon. Everything round and pale and glowing is the moon to her right now, which I think is a reasonable approach to being new in the world. Name the things that light up. Start there. I think about my mother more than I talk about. I think about how much she would have loved this child. Loved the way Lily runs without looking. The way she slaps book pages with her whole palm to turn them. The way she looks at me when she wants to be picked up. Arms up, absolute certainty. My mother worked 6 days a week, smelling like bleach and exhaustion, and she never once let me feel like I was less than everything to her, which is the most sophisticated form of love I have ever encountered, and I am trying every day to be half as good at it as she was. I think she would have liked my office too. The floor to ceiling windows, the view. I think she would have stood at that window in the early morning and just breathed. If you've stayed with me this long, if you've been here from the beginning, from the Christmas dinner and the cleaning schedule and the parking lot and the February light, then you already know this wasn't really a story about revenge. Revenge is a word that makes it sound smaller than it was. This was a story about knowing your own worth at every point in the process, even when the process required you to pretend you didn't. This was a story about a little girl on a kitchen floor with a bruised arm who needed her mother to finally stop being careful and start being deliberate. This was a story about what it costs to be a Black woman in spaces that were not designed with you in mind, and what it looks like when you decide that cost is no longer acceptable. I'm not going to tell you that you should do what I did. I'm not going to hand you a blueprint. What I am going to tell you is this: you already know what you're worth. You have always known. The question is only whether you're willing to act like it. If nobody said it to you today, if you've been shrinking yourself down for someone who has never once asked why you're not taking up more space, I want you to hear this from me. You are allowed to be the whole of what you are, every part, even the parts that make certain rooms uncomfortable, especially those parts. Leave me a comment. Tell me your story, where you're at, what you're carrying, what you're building. I read everything. And if this one meant something to you, share it with someone who needs it tonight. Subscribe if you want to stay. There is more, there is always more, and I will be here. I'm Maya Reeves. I own the building, and I am just getting started